y'all, I'm Erin Jean Ward, broadcasting live from the Good News and Gratitude podcast from United Thank Offering. If you're new here, we explore the gratitude and good news we find in Scripture, the world around us, the wisdom of our amazing guests, and through cultivating our own gratitude practices. We're choosing prayer over perfection as we try to remember the good news of hope and joy that surround us and sustain us. Let's dive in. Hey y'all, I'm so excited to be welcoming the Reverend Sarah Condon to our podcast today to receive her wisdom and good news. The Reverend Sarah Condon is an Episcopal priest in Nashville. She is a co-host of the Mockingcast and a regular contributor to Mockingbird Ministries. She regularly speaks at churches and conferences around the country. Now, let's take a moment and dive in. Good morning. It is so good to be with you today. I am so excited to share someone with our community who is such a source of as much comedy as wisdom, I think. And that is a really holy mix for people to have, that mix of being able to really speak into the profound depth of the human experience, but to also acknowledge that the depth of the human experience is funny, that it has this reality of being able to hold depth and levity. Sometimes I think in the same breath. You know, I have felt such depth and such levity in moments that I've spent with you. And so, Sarah, it is a real honor to have you here on the Good News and Gratitude podcast. And first of all, just to dive in, I wanted to just hear a little bit. You know, we know your bio, we know a lot about your professional life, but tell me about the shape of your life and what are the inklings of joy that you find in where you are in your life right now?
Well, thanks for having me. And I think we can't talk about being funny and also being, having having a reaction to things without me mentioning Paul Zoll, who was such a mentor to me in so many ways, and taught me that, you know, you have to make people laugh if they're going to hear what you're saying. So, and related, I love, and you and I share this, we talk about it a lot, I love stand-up comedy. So that always gives my life some depth and some meaning. And I'm a mom. I've got 2 kids. We're at that point where we're watching them get old enough that you can imagine them leaving. And so I know there are a lot of days that it's like, wow, this is really hard, and also it's really short. And trying to hold that as a reality has become a daily practice for all of us, I think, but especially for my husband, Josh, and myself. We're new to this city. We've been in Nashville, Tennessee for a year and a half now, and so a lot of my days are still sort of settling, and we'll get there, but also because of tragedy in my life, I have a lot of stuff, just literally a lot of stuff, and so there's still lots of my life that is sorting stuff, for better or worse, but making things beautiful in the midst of that has been, I think, a really important practice.
You know, you were talking about stuff, and it's so interesting. I just had this conversation with my mom a couple days ago because she was looking for a file. Like, she was looking for a file, and she didn't expect it to be so emotionally evocative. But in order to find that in the filing cabinet, she had to go past birth certificates of both of her children and just these little things that are truly like files, but gosh, there's just so much more than that, right? Like, when you go through things, we know that things are not the person, and yet it's not that we think that those things are the person, it's that it brings us back to the person. It shows us and reminds us who they are, and all of those memories that can be both full of levity and full of difficulty. You know, those memories all flood to the surface. And so I know what it feels like to think I'm looking through a box, just in a very pragmatic, gotta sort this stuff and get it to Goodwill, and then find myself on the sofa crying like an hour later.
Totally.
It's
Yeah.
just a
It's
whiplash.
dangerous to try to find a file.
Dangerous.
It's
like therapist on deck for you to find a file.
I know. I know. It's true. It's really true. Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
and that actually leads into the reason that I wanted to have you on the podcast. I mean, there's lots of reasons I wanted to have you on the podcast because you're great, but something that we have shared and that we have bonded over, amidst many other things, is that we have been in these grief journeys, right? And, as many of our listeners know, I'm on a grief journey after the death of my sister. And I wanted to invite you, because I know that you do talk about this and share this with people, to talk a little bit about your grief journey so that we can both hold that with you and also, learn through your experiences about how we can tend to our own grief and then also love others who are grieving.
Sure. So, 4 years ago, plus some months, my parents died together in a car accident at the same time. And I try to be really specific when I say that because my experience has been that when I would sort of try to relay that, to a doctor or a lawyer or at the bank and all these places that I was having to explain what happened, people would often say like, well, they didn't both die, or, but your mom is okay, or they're okay. And so I think it's I remember even writing about it in Word, and it couldn't do the plural of like parents' deaths.
Wow.
Because it was like, this can't be possible, kind of thing. So I try to be really specific that they both died. Their names were Deborah and Owen, and I miss them all the time. And, one of my really good friends, David Zoll, who I do the podcast with, he came to their funeral, which was no small thing because it was in the middle of the Mississippi Delta.
Oh.
And he came to their funeral, and afterwards he asked me, and I have no memory of this, like he had to tell me later, but he asked me, we were eating fried chicken and drinking Chardonnay together, and he said, like the day of, like that evening, we were at dinner, and he said, why didn't you give a eulogy for your parents? Because I didn't do the eulogy, my brother did. And I said, well, I think the rest of my life will probably be a eulogy. So, and I think that's proven to be very true. Yeah. So, I think it's a part of the way God has shaped my story for good, which is probably a painful thing for people to hear, and it's a painful thing to say, but I do think it's changed my ministry for good. It's changed my priesthood for good. It's changed the way that I understand the cross for good. But it's tremendously painful.
Well, and what I specifically, when I was thinking about having you here, because again, as much as that is so real and so powerful, I don't know about your experience, but when I looked at Holy Week after my sister died, it really changed for me. Like, I was able to look back and see, and this is one of the reasons I wanted to have you on the podcast as we kind of are in Holy Week and pivoting into Easter. Before my sister died, I was very much a person who would say, and I still believe this, but it has shifted. I would very much be the person who says, I don't live out of fear of hell or hope of heaven. Like, if none of that is true, I live because the living witness of Jesus on earth has made me a Christian. But what shifted after my sister died is that now I desperately hope in heaven.
Sure, yeah.
Like, I used to think it would be really cool if that happened. Like, I hope that is what awaits us. But now I have this like deep need for heaven to be real, because I actually need to have that reunion in a very like real way. But because of that, it's changed Holy Week for me. And I think, you know, in Holy Week and as we move into Easter, we look at life, death, and resurrection, which means that it is necessarily evocative for people on a grief journey, right? To be going through this. And so I'm curious, when you look at kind of the Triduum, the Paschal mystery, what we act out in that, I know you said that your parents' death had really affected your theology of the cross. Tell me a little bit more about what the Christian story means to you in light of this and in light of how it has changed your ministry.
You know, I think it's funny. I think there's like two places that I really, really feel the presence of my parents. And one is if I'm having a margarita in a Mexican restaurant, because it softens the edges a little bit. And also Mexican restaurants are exactly what the house I grew up in looks like. So whenever I'm in, if there's like sautillo tile, a strong peach, and a turquoise, I'm back in Mississippi, weirdly. But the other place I feel it is in prayer, that I really feel their presence. And that has been jarring for me. I remember within, probably 6 months of their deaths, I was a college chaplain at Rice University. And I was standing up to do the Eucharist, and it was in the middle of the pandemic. So we're like outside, there's like a smattering of kids, you know. It was very homemade. And you know this about me, but my, I'm not a high church girl, you know, and pretty low church when it comes to the Eucharist, like all that kind of stuff. And I felt like this beautiful weight of their presence on either shoulder while I was celebrating communion. And it was so crazy, you know? So it's, they enter in these bizarre spaces. And Holy Week is one of those bizarre spaces where the nearness of God is so present. And I grieve for people that have lost people that don't have faith. I really do, because the nearness I feel to them through God is so unique to me. Like, it just is so powerful and overwhelming. And, last year, and I'm already anxious about Easter a little bit, because last year, we got to Easter. Holy Week was hard. And we talk about this all the time as friends, but, I'm an Enneagram 3. So whenever things are really hard, I just ignore it and say that I'm stronger, which never works out, weirdly. But I keep trying. I keep trying.
This sounds different.
One day. So I kind of like just powered through Holy Week in a pretty self-destructive way, and then got to Easter morning and was like, oh, thank God, this is almost over. This is almost over. And then I look out in the pews, and I see this woman from behind that looks just like my mom, and she has on a high neck silk, like think fancy Chico's, turquoise, of course, middle-aged lady jacket, and I could see her turning to smile and like see my mom's face. Like, it was so crazy and intense. And, in our context, I'm married to the priest, and I'm literally standing up, like on, like just like almost in the pew, just to the side, just like having a panic attack, staring at this woman thinking it's my mom in church on Easter. And, I go outside and I just am sobbing, and it's like, of course my mom showed up on Easter, right? I mean, like, there's no other way. Of course she showed up on Easter. So I kind of enter into these spaces like Holy Week with a fair amount of like, just, I don't think excitement or anxiety are exactly the right word, but just some like facing reality, that like the reality is that this is when I face them. Yeah. Does that make sense? Like, yeah, I just know something is going to happen, because this is like when they are most near to me.
When you talk about it, it makes me think of the language that I've never used. I mean, I guess I've never explicitly used this language, but Holy Week is a thin space, right? Like it is a
Oh, for
thin
sure.
space. And,
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
one of the ways that I see that is the fact that, I've been a priest, 12 years or something, and how is it that these liturgies still feel like I might be doing them for the first time? Like, why is it
Yeah.
that every Maundy Thursday kind of feels like the first Maundy Thursday I've ever attended? Even though,
Yeah.
and it's because it is the first Maundy Thursday I've ever attended in that way, right? Like, in that moment in my life, in that reality in my life, those liturgies like really greet us anew, and they become like the Bible, like a living word, right? It's a living enacted drama. And actually, when you were talking about seeing your mom, and it's interesting, I go to Sarah's church, and Sarah and Josh's church, and I remember you told me I went to give you an Easter hug, and you were
Uh,
like, I could tell there was like makeup gone under your eyes, like when you
yes.
got
Yeah.
post cleanup. You know how
Yeah.
when a person has cleaned up all their tears. You had like cleaned up your
Yes.
tears, and we
Yes.
like hugged and said
Yeah.
Happy Easter, and you told me. And as I hear you tell it now, it strikes me that this is like a mystical experience. When we think
Mhm.
about, we read all of the mystics, Hildegard and all of these
Mhm.
people, Julian of Norwich. It's like you had a mystical experience, and I think in modernity, and especially what we might call post-modernity, we love to write that off as coincidence. Oh, of course,
Right.
everyone has the exact same jawline and wardrobe as my, saint
Right.
mother.
Right.
It's
Right.
like, no,
Right.
I think
Right.
God was
Right.
like, hey, babe, I think you need to see your mom today. And it's going to be
Yeah.
hard. But if Jesus is going to resurrect today, I want you to know I took Deb with me. Right?
Mm.
Like, we're going to
Yeah. Yeah.
celebrate
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
resurrected Jesus. And I want you to know that when we do that, your mom's here.
Right.
Oh, that
Yeah.
gives me chills.
Totally. I mean, yeah. I mean, it gives me chills too. I think, I think Holy Week is like one of those things we don't want to do.
It's
Like
hard.
really, it's like who wants to go wash other people's feet? Who wants to go like think about the pain and agony of the cross? Like I totally get that there are these other Christian traditions out there that are like, thank you, we'll just do Easter. Like, you know what I mean? Like I totally get it. Like, but also, like, it ain't Easter without Holy Week. Like, it's really not, you're skipping, it's this, it really comes down to this idea of sanctification,
Mm.
which for me has been another thing that's changed so much in my theology. I really, really, really believe that sanctification only comes through suffering.
Mm.
And so I think we're mistaken when we think we can be holy and righteous and well behaved on Easter if we haven't been through. First of all, I don't think that's what you have to be on Easter, but I think if we skip this Holy Week suffering and we skip the kind of facing of the self and the facing of the sin and the facing of the sorrow, it's just kind of it's half as loud when you get to Easter.
It also makes me think about, just from a recovery coaching standpoint, when we numb emotions, we aren't helping them. Like
Right.
they're just still there.
They're still
They're
there,
just gonna show
girl.
up when you're in hangover mode, not when you're, like
Yeah.
they're still gonna be waiting
Yeah.
on you, which is
Yeah.
why
Yeah.
processing our emotions, reaching out to people, actually seeking support, that actually completes the stress cycle for us. It helps us move through
Yeah.
that so that we actually get to the end of that feeling, um, towards sanctification. I would say, to use your language, when we process our feelings, that is part of what leads us into that positivity that comes through suffering, which even in scripture we know, like, suffering produces endurance, produces all of
Mm-hmm.
these capacities for us to really be with and know God. And in our suffering, we are joined to Christ. And so, as
Mm-hmm.
much as we don't want to say suffering's good, let's make sure everyone suffers, what we do want to acknowledge is the reality of human existence. And human existence has suffering, because I don't want it to seem like we're glorifying it, right? Because then we can get into things like self-flagellation and things that maybe are not the ideal for what we hope for, but suffering is a reality of the human experience.
I don't get afraid that we're telling people that suffering is necessary for sanctification, because like you can't create your own like suffering's not a choice.
Sure.
Like suffering is right. Like suffering is the human existence. Like I've got 2 middle schoolers. Like it's inescapable, like it's every day for them. So, I just like, I always want to push back against this idea that somehow in our suffering we become holier because we follow all the right steps and do all the right things. And it's like, that's still trying to control something that's uncontrollable.
And I fully agree with that. I think what I'm talking about is when we have opportunities to help people who are suffering, we should be doing that. As opposed to, you know what, you're just going through trials. God puts us through trials.
Right.
And I think so my hesitation is also related more to sort of like, if we look at suffering to be this thing that is good, we may take away our ability to help people who are suffering. Because one of the things that I think happens in suffering is that you then call on your community, you humble yourself, you ask for the support you need. And also a place where pride comes in, and I'll say this about myself and my suffering, is like my pride says I don't need anybody. Like my pride says I can buy a journal and I'll just journal my way through it and we'll be right as rain. And it's like, no, you need the people with whom you can fall apart. You need to be able to go sit in a pew and lose yourself. You need to have these moments where, God in the form of the body of Christ meets you in your suffering. Because even when Jesus is in his suffering, Mary, his mother, they're looking at him, they're with him. Like he is not even alone on the cross. And so 100% believe that suffering is it's going to happen. You're not going to escape it. It's going to be part of your life. And it also allows us and invites us into the opportunity to really turn to God and turn to the church.
Yeah.
And I think you have spoken to this, and I'll speak to this. As much as I would never have asked for any of this to happen, I do see, what is the scripture that says, this is a paraphrase, but like God can turn things into good. Like things do not have to be good in order to be.
God uses all things for good.
Yes, exactly. So it's like, I would never ask for this. You would never ask for this. And also it has shaped us and shaped our faith in a way that I can call good. I'm curious, when we have talked just personally about grief, you've done a lot more, I would say, than me, like grief work, in the sense that you've like sought out books and resources. And so I'm wondering, what are some of the insights that you have gathered that have helped you in your grief, helped you maybe even understand your grief, but also that might like help other people, our listeners, as they grieve? I know there were some books and resources you read that were incredibly and powerful, and so I was just wondering if you could share that.
Sure. So I would say like the top book that's been really helpful for me that's secular is The Grieving Brain. It's based in neuroscience.
Love neuroscience.
And it's really helpful if you're in the middle of grief. And I would suggest it to people who are like any sort of grief, like you're going through a divorce, up into like, you've lost a child, like sort of the worst of the worst, because it gives you some, it's like any good therapy. It gives you some space to understand what's happening about yourself. And so, that the feelings that you have are really normal. And what I love is, a lot of times in grief circles we'll say like there's no right way to grieve, but actually there are some really good things you can do to help. And one of those that I always find so moving and important is that laughter is really valuable. So we often, when we talk about grief or when we look at people in our lives who are grieving, we'll say, well, gosh, they made too many jokes, or like they're laughing a lot and you can tell they're not dealing with it. And there's so much research that tells us that actually like grief is pretty inescapable, especially like catastrophic grief. And if you're not dealing with somebody who's on substance, they're probably in grief, right? Do you know what I mean? Like if they're not finding a way out, they're probably in it. But that grief is like water. And so you're sort of under the ocean, and then maybe you tell a joke about the person who died, or maybe you watch stand-up comedy or whatever. And that will actually take your head above water for a minute, and you'll get some oxygen, and then you're going to go back down, but it gives you that break. There's this beautiful couple of pages in the book that talks about, it sort of lays out these examples of 4 different people grieving 4 different ways. And I can't remember all of them, but one of them was like stays home and journals. One of them was like sits at home, looks at like photographs and like thinks about the person, calls someone that like remembers them and talks to them. And then the last one was like goes to a party. And they were like, which person do you think has the best outcomes? And it's the person that goes to the party, because they get out of themselves, right? It's like in AA, they always say like, it's good to be of service. And there's an element of like, you're getting out of yourself for a minute. So that was like very, very helpful information for me, and good news and a relief to me. So that was very helpful. Some like really weird stuff that I found helpful that is not for everybody. I think you love Rob Delaney the way I love Rob Delaney. Yeah.
And he's got some heavy comedy, but wow.
Girl. Whoa. And he wrote this fabulous book because his son died of cancer as like a baby, like 2 years old, the worst thing. And he talks in that book about how much horror was helpful for him. And there's a lot of research about that. So horror actually gives, which I never watched scary stuff before my parents died, but it gives your brain a break. It just gives your brain a little break. So especially when you're in really, really deep, profound grief, because it is so jarring, it gives you another thing to think about. So, I remember watching the movie Midsummer. I know, within a couple of months of them dying, and it is so graphic. There's dead parents, there's a cult, a boyfriend gets burned alive. And I remember at the end, my husband Josh looks at me and he's totally horrified. Yeah. And I'm smiling. And I think it was just this physical, like my brain was like, thank you for giving me, albeit a pretty weird break, but a break, So yeah, I mean, those are some of the sort of more secular things, the neurological things I found helpful. There is a wonderful book, and I have it on my nightstand. I could just go grab it, but
Well, one thing that, when you were talking about just while you look for that, I think it's really helpful to talk about the party aspect of that, because I feel like one of the definitive feelings I have around my grief is survivor's guilt. Like this feeling of, why is it that I'm still alive and they're not, right? Yeah. And I think that means that I often like guilt and shame myself for laughter. Like the other day, I was watching a funny video and it just hit me, and I was like, shouldn't I be doing grief work? Or, is it okay that I'm just happy today? Like, is it okay that I'm having a good day? Yeah. Right? Yeah. And so I think even just acknowledging the neuroscience behind it, of saying like, no, this is good. This is helpful. This is not in opposition to your love for them.
Right. Right. And it's funny. So that makes me think of 2 things. The first is, both my parents had super tragic childhood. So, dad lost his dad to alcoholism when he was 16. My dad was the oldest of 4. My mom's father suffered from bipolar depression and I've heard this phrase recently and really loved it, a death of despair by his own hand when she was 2 years old. So lots and lots of heaviness. And the gift they gave me is they were always really honest with me about that. And there was something really freeing about laughing, because I think I had seen people who really suffered, who are honest about their suffering, like also laugh. Like, it's weird. It's like, I don't think God was just planting seeds. I always say, I think God was showing me the whole field. Looking back, like kind of preparing me for that. and I have perimenopause, so I can't remember what the second thing was, but
I also have that, and I don't know what the second one was going to be.
But I found the title of the book.
We love it.
It's called, so it's a weird book. It's a weird title. Don't let it put you off. It's called The Cure for Sorrow. Do you know this book?
Oh, yes, you gave that to me.
So good.
Richardson.
Yes. It's a book of blessings for times of grief. So it's these beautiful I don't even know if there's a 2-pager in there. Little blessings, prayers. And in those early days, and like I said, it's still on my nightstand, but in those early days, I would just flip it open and find something. And it all just spoke to me, and in a way that was religious,
Yes.
but not heavy-handed.
Oh, yeah. It feels like a prayer. Like when I read them, they feel like blessings and prayers.
Yeah.
And I'll never forget when you gave me that book and said, ignore the title. Because it's just like when you're in the midst of grief, you're like, the cure.
The cure? Who are you, Jan? Yeah, exactly.
Get out of my house. Get out of my house. So I always ignore the title.
Do I burn books now? Yeah, exactly.
Well, and the other thing, that I have used it for is in the intercessory prayer time, if I'm doing like morning prayer, sometimes I'll grab one of those because I think this actually goes back also to the power of horror. So I love horror. I was like reading Stephen King when I was 12. It's one of my things.
Yeah.
But
you've always been a horror girl. Yeah.
I've always been a horror girly.
Yeah.
And I turned out just fine. No, I love horror, but one of the things that I love about horror, and when you look at it in more of a literary standpoint, is that horror is really the passageway into us looking into our deepest fears, right? Mm-hmm. And one of the ultimate deepest fear that most humans hold is around death, period. Right? Which is also why Holy Week is so powerful, because it is about reckoning with the most intense human form of fear that we have, which is our death, but it also meets it with hope, right? And if you really study horror, if you really watch it, it is so much about God. I mean, so much of horror is about God. And I don't mean, Christianity.com made a horror movie. I mean, like, it is, even secular, like Stephen King, who has a Roman Catholic background. If you read any of his work, there is faith dabbled all in that. And that is what I live for. Like, I love that intersection. And so it makes total sense to me that horror can be both what I call healthy escapism, which is, I think, what you're talking about when you're talking about turning your brain off for a hot minute. I think there's healthy escapism in horror, but also it's part of meaning making. And I think that meaning making, there are these memes that are like, all a girl wants is to solve a puzzle. Like, all a girl wants is to, like, see a pattern, and I'm one of those people. And so meaning making is incredibly powerful for me. And so when we look at horror, and also when we understand horror as being in relation to comedy, right? So when we look at the scales of the kind of arc that we make with comedy and horror, I think that it's interesting to see how they go together. And I would say it's unsurprising to me that I'm obsessed with both, right?
Yeah.
Because they're different sides of the same coin.
Yeah.
When you were talking about comedy, a comedian I really admire is Pete Davidson, which I know he has a pop culture rap, but one of the things that I really like about him is his father died in 9/11. He was one of the firefighters who went, and he talks about it and he laughs about it, and it's uncomfortable.
Yeah.
But it also is like his real experience of losing his father in a very, very, very public, difficult way, and then kind of existing in that. I mean, I can't imagine losing your father in 9/11 and just being like, and I'm just going to live in New York.
Right. He lived with his mom for a lot, like well into adulthood. I mean, he just, and then he's on this show that like exemplifies, like, it is the height of like comedy in New York City. I mean, it makes me think of how right after they talk about how after 9/11 happened, Saturday Night Live, like, was like, do we even keep going? Like, do we even keep doing a show? And then here we are decades later, and like a child of of that horror, right, is one of the greatest stars that come out of the show. I mean, it's just, yeah, they're so linked. It's so linked. It's so misplaced for us as Christians to not see, because it's all just the height of human emotions, right? To not see these things all interrelated, right? To not see horror and humor and deep faith and all these things like so deeply interrelated. I mean, I think of Stephen Colbert, right? One of the funniest people who lives right now, who, you know, lost his siblings and his father in this terrible plane accident. And, you know, and he says, I mean, he did a brilliant podcast with Anderson Cooper. And he says, like, basically, and he's super, super faithful Catholic, that, you know, he wouldn't wish his life to go any differently. And I think that's so hard for people to hear, but it's a different side of the same coin with Pete Davidson. It's like, you know, this is the holy discomfort.
Yes. Well, and what is the point of wishing my life different when that isn't going to happen?
100% agree. 100% agree.
What am
it's
I
like,
wishing
that's not a
for?
choice. Yeah.
We're here.
Yeah.
We're here right now.
We're here now.
I just have to make sense of my life as it stands.
100. It drives me crazy when people are like, well, I guess you wish blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, I don't, because what a waste of time that is. Like, that's not my reality. Like, my brain, and that's the thing about the book, The Grieving Brain, my brain is already having to work in overtime to connect to the reality of what's happened. Yes. The last thing I'm going to do, right, is spend some time making that harder, wishing something. Like, I can't do that.
My wishes are that I will get a parking spot at the restaurant with terrible parking. Do you know what I mean? Like, that's where the wishes land for me.
Yes.
But we're not imagining I'm serious. I'm like,
achievable wishes.
Yeah. I want low grade, managed expectations wishes, because we can also construct an alternative reality that will never happen and then live in prolonged sorrow over the fact that the thing that was never going to happen for us didn't happen.
Yeah.
And you have to start asking, how did I end up here? I think it's me, right? Like, I think I ended up in this type of despair because I was not able to process the reality of my life right now.
Right.
So one of the things that we obviously focus on here at UTO is gratitude. And when I look at, I do think that things like comedy, expression, processing things, these are all things I'm deeply grateful for, right? But I wanted to know, as trite as it may sound, I do believe the adage that says that grief is the cost for having loved, right? Because as I say all the time, we don't grieve people we don't know, right? Like, and I don't mean that negatively. We sometimes can grieve like pop stars and stuff like that, but like we tend to really grieve the people who we loved. And so I do see this connection between gratitude for the life that I was able to ever know and love, and yet the loss of its exit being so profound. And so I wanted to ask you, have there been poignant moments where you have felt gratitude in this journey?
For sure. Just in the days that followed the accident, it was in the middle of COVID, and a large part of my family is like in the medical world: doctors, nurse practitioners, nurses, pharmacists.
During
literally.
COVID.
Yeah, and so they were super, super careful. And I remember when they died, I was like, okay, well, I guess I'll show up at my house. I know my brother's going to come into town. I have a brother I really love. He's going to come into town with his then fiance. And then we got to the house, and like my entire family was in the house. No one had masks on. Everyone was, and we were a masking family. Deborah and Owen were masking people, baby. And so they stood out in Mississippi. And so to walk into this home and have it filled with all these people we loved. My cousins brought their babies, and they had cleaned the house because, of course, my mom was in the middle of some sorting project, and they had gotten everything out of there. I had a cousin that came in who's in the military, and he knew he was not going to get time off for the funeral, so he took time then. And this is a guy who like never has time to come home. And he came home, and literally the only thing he did was he stood in the kitchen, he heated up plates of lasagna for people, and like swept the floor and kept the kitchen clean. Like that's my memory of him. Like that's just what he did the whole time. I mean, there was so much, like I always say, we've no one's ever gone through what we've gone through and been so fortunate in terms of like the way that family stepped in such a profound way. But I do think like when we came home to Houston and we're trying to navigate this whole new part of life, like I just had women in my life that reached out. And I mean, I'll never forget my friend Christine called me and she said, "Hey, I'm done with work. I'm about to go pick up the girls. I've got 15 minutes. Can I come unload your dishwasher?"
No.
And at that point, like I couldn't get off the couch, and like she did. She came and unloaded the dishwasher. Yeah, I was so grateful for that. The other thing that I was really grateful for was, and I think we've talked about this a little bit, but I dated somebody pretty seriously in college who was Jewish, and really toyed with the idea of conversion to Judaism and so much about the religion that I just absolutely am still in love with. And I knew a little bit about the grief work that happens in Judaism, and there's such an absence of that for us in Christianity.
Amen.
And I was blessed to have a Jewish therapist, and she really talked me through, even when there was like this brutal, very Protestant, we got to keep going, we got a to-do list, we got to, I remember she would say to me like, just quietly, she's like, if you were Jewish, you would be on your couch right now and someone would be feeding you with a spoon. Like you wouldn't even be feeding yourself, and like just that like deeper spiritual ancient knowledge of how we should actually be dealing with grief was such a gift to me. I always tell people now, like, we need to be a lot more Jewish when people die. Because, the other thing they do, and I'm with you, because I want to relate back to what you were talking about earlier. I'm so with you in the idea of, like, heaven as a comfort now, as a deep comfort. But for me, right after they died, because, and it, this is not different for you. It was so sudden. It felt very physically violent. It was really hard for me when people would say like, "Oh, they're in heaven now." And all I could imagine, because it was a car accident and my dad was driving, was that my mom was just yelling at my dad wherever they were. Like there was no like heavenly vision for it. And I remember learning years ago in Judaism that, when people are sitting Shiva, which I'm sure most people know what that is, it's after someone dies and you're in the house, you stay in the house and people come to you and they bring you food and you cover the mirrors. And it's just this beautiful, beautiful tradition. But one of the rules is you don't come in and talk religion. You come in and you talk about the person. So your role as someone who's helping people grieve is you come in and you say, "Hey, I remember when your dad did this. I loved this about your mom." But the last thing you do is come in and you say, "God needed another angel."
Yes.
Or, one of the worst things people would say to me was like, "Of course they had to die together. They were so in love." And I would just say, I feel like my mom would have been just fine. She'd probably taken a cruise to Puerto Rico. You know what I mean? I'm just like, I don't know what your version of their marriage was, but like they'd have figured it out, So there's something, I'm so grateful for Judaism in the midst of grief. Honestly, that was such a huge, huge thing for me. And still is.
Well, and the book that I mentioned earlier that I couldn't think of the title is Everything Happens for a Reason and Other Lies I've Loved. Mm-hmm. And that is what I meant when I meant the like trite understanding of suffering.
Yeah.
Like, oh, you're suffering, but God's got it.
Right.
Like, and like, what does that mean for me? Like, I don't not believe that God's got it.
Right.
Like, I'm still suffering. And
like, can he send me a memo of what like godding it looks like?
Yeah, like, I'm around.
I'm gonna need bullet points for what this means.
Or like God needed another angel. I'm like, God has plenty. I'm not
God's
entirely
good.
sure.
I don't think that's how it works.
Yeah, like, and it's just, and I know it's people trying, but it's
Yeah.
deeply unhelpful. And
Yeah.
so just acknowledging for me that yes, suffering is everyone's thing that they're going to go through, and also there's ways that we can be supportive toward that. And I love the idea that we don't rush in with spiritual platitudes, that we
Yeah.
actually rush in with memory. And I think
Yes.
so much of, to me, the drama of Holy Week and what we're doing is we're remembering. And remember, that is to bring together the members, right? It is to take the disparate parts of ourselves and remember them. And so when we remember Christ's passion and death, we also remember the stories of those that we love. And All Saints is also, I think, an especially poignant time, because that's when we really acknowledge the personal saints in our lives. But I can't go into Holy Week and not pray for those people I love who have passed, because it is this week, it is the week of Holy Week that allows me to have that hope for heaven.
Yeah. 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 Yeah, I totally agree about All Saints. I feel like that's as Jewish as we get, for the best. I do, for the best of us. But yeah, I mean, I'm sure you've had this experience. Like, the prayers of the people are different, like when you acknowledge those people who've died, it's like, oh, this is like a visual for me, right? I mean, we have dead grandmothers we loved, for sure. But this is different, it's, you're remembering these people in such a different way. Yeah. And it's part of what I love about the tradition that we're in, honestly, because there's so much room for sadness just in our liturgy, and there's so much room for sadness in Holy Week.
It was when you were talking about the intercessory prayers, we have in the Book of Common Prayer, there's a space where we would, in some forms of prayer, we would just say, people who are struggling, people that we care about, we pray for them. And then later we pray for the dead. And I remember the first time I ever prayed for the dead, and I realized that my sister had moved from the top of the prayer to that part. Sorry, I'm getting emotional. It was very, very powerful for me to feel that move, right? But it also makes me, one of the questions I wanted to ask you is that is a spiritual practice that has been really powerful for me, being able to name her in those prayers. What are some of the spiritual practices, and I'm not talking like big things, but are there, we talked about comedy, we talked about horror, all of which I think can be spiritual in their own right, because joy is spiritual. But are there any specific ways of praying that have just felt like a balm to you?
I mean, I hate to say this because it sounds like such a stupid, unachievable thing. And so I just want to say to people before I say it that I wanted to do this for years, and it didn't really happen in my life until God decided it would happen in my life. I grew up with a grandmother who was raised by her grandmother who remembered the Civil War. Yeah. So I grew up with a grandmother who was of an entirely different generation. And she would kneel at her bedside every night and pray. And, I would share a bed with her, and when I stayed with her, and it made such a big impression on me, and it wasn't something I'd seen in my household of origin. And for whatever reason, God saw fit. And I always say it was in November of, I swear it was 2017. I mean, it was the most random, it wasn't New Year's, it wasn't Lent, it wasn't any of those moments where this is it, it wasn't, it was just randomly laid upon me. And, I started kneeling before bed and praying. And I have to say, thank God for that practice. And sometimes I'm there for 3 to 5 minutes. Sometimes I'm there for 45 seconds. But there's such an element of laying my day to rest. And it was a spiritual practice that was so helpful right when they died, because I can remember being at their house and gathering up all the, you know how like you look at stuff when you're a kid and you're like, man, I'm going to get that stuff when my parents die. And then suddenly you get it a lot earlier. And for me, that was the quilts from Louisiana. I always wanted, you know, they go back generations. I'm sure you have these in your family. And I like stacked them all on the bed and just threw myself. I mean, on my knees, I threw myself on the bed and with my upper body and just wept and, you know, cried out to God and asked for my parents to come back. And, you know, I think there's something about that posture. Yeah. And I had the spiritual director, Sarah Flick, she's so great in the Diocese of Texas. She's top tier. Yes. And I remember she told me that she discovered when she was in her 20s that you could kneel in the pew and kind of position your body over the, you know, the pew in front of you. And it's almost like you're being held.
Oh, wow.
You know, because we always think of kneeling as like this really submissive posture and, you know, and blah, 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 blah. And it is all those things. And also, right, it is this way of being held. And so I think for me at my bedside, especially, that's become it's a really helpful thing.
It reminds me, interestingly enough, my spiritual director, Danielle Schroyer, who's awesome, she said something similar, but it was to take a bath and to feel held in those primordial waters of God. And it has become a real spiritual practice for me. Because the other thing that is so practical is like, I don't take my phone into the bath, you know, so like it helps me literally get away. It's also, there's a sense of intense vulnerability and nakedness, you know, and so it very much is like me as a child again, really kind of going into a womb space in order to say, you know, God, what are you generating in my life? And it's of incredible comfort to me. And it's one of the ways that I posture myself, because you're right. Like, there's reasons we kneel in church and stand in church. It's like posturing, as long as we're not being ableist, you know, posturing can be really, really helpful. And we can posture ourselves in different ways with different abilities. But I love the idea of kneeling to pray. I mean, there's a reason that's the Precious Moments picture, you know, like there's a reason. People did this for a very long time, and it was their way of posturing their bodies in a way that says, this isn't how I typically sit, this isn't how I typically am. And that is what is like reminding me that what I'm doing is not what I'm typically doing. I'm talking to God right now.
For sure. Yeah.
Well, I adore you and love that I get to share you with our community. Yeah. I want to know, now that everyone here is a fan of you, where can we go to connect with you, to follow you? Tell us like how we can connect with you.
Probably the primary way is through Mockingbird. So that's an organization I've been with for, I always have to date this by how old our daughter is, for about a decade. And we do a podcast twice a month called the Mockingcast. You can listen there. And I write for them some, and I speak for them. I'll be in New York speaking for them in a couple of weeks. And yeah, that's kind of where I live right now. So.
Well, and definitely check out, the podcast is amazing. I also love your writings. Your essays are funny and incisive and wise. And also, one of the things that you do so beautifully well that I think we really try to do on this podcast is to take these big realities and bring them home.
Yeah.
When you said that, like, walking into a Mexican restaurant, you feel like you're at home, I'm like, that's the kind of, like, that is holy.
Yeah.
And I don't know that we always associate the mundane, that what we might call mundane, as being the actual magnificent holiness
It's where it lives for me, and I know it's where it lives for you. Absolutely.
Because that's incarnate.
Yeah.
Right? That's real. Yeah. And so I think I love a good lofty read every now and then, but what I really need as far as comfort and relief and support is, I need to have those proverbial Mexican restaurant moments in my life. Sarah, thank you so much for your time. It's been an honor and a gift and a blessing. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
The Good News and Gratitude podcast is a gift from United Thank Offering. We'd love for you to subscribe on your favorite podcast app and share this with a friend. Don't forget to rate the show too. Make sure to follow UTO on Facebook and Instagram at United Thank Offering. And follow me on Instagram and Blue Sky at Erin Jean Ward. Our show is produced by Asma Lee, for whom we give great thanks. And of course, our deepest thanks to you, our listeners. I pray you have time this week to prayerfully remember those you love and see no longer. Bless y'all.